Well, welcome back, folks, to another episode of American Genesis, the creation of America's Scripture. We're finishing the executive branch today. I hope you all had a very Merry Christmas and hope you have a good New Year. And hopefully, it will be a one of health and wealth and wisdom. So let's begin with a little music.
If tomorrow all the things were lost I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I'd thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died and gave that right to me. And I'd gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
Okay, well, it's usually this time in my program that I start with trivia question. I'm not going to do that today. I think most of you are aware that we lost a former president over the weekend, Jimmy Carter. And, you know, people have different feelings about Jimmy Carter's presidency. There are some that thought he was a very good president. There's several that think he was not a very effective president. But I think what everyone agrees with, and I agree with that, is that there's probably never been a better person in my lifetime, at least, that's been president of the United States. He was one of the most decent men that I think we probably ever had that's held that office. And I like this quote: I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. My faith demands that I do whatever I can, wherever I am, whenever I can, for as long as I can, with whatever I have to try and make a difference. What a real testimony. I look at that and I think, that's the way to live your life right there. And Jimmy Carter did that. He's a very good man and a very good person. And so, with that being said, let's move on. Let's review. Last week, we began by looking at the layers of the presidential advisors, which consisted of the cabinet, the executive branch, the West Wing, the political advisors, and the vice president. We looked at all those different elements and saw how they were comprised and how they were put in office. Then we reviewed the different approaches to leadership styles. Different presidents had different approaches. We just mentioned Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter had an approach that he was kind of a micromanager, which is one of the reasons some people think his presidency might not have been as effective as those who are kind of a little bit more of a hands-off. Every president has their own style that they approach the presidency and how they run it. We next looked at the office duties of the vice president, which for the most part in the history of our country has been a pretty insignificant office. They kind of, one person said, kind of humorously, said, my job is to go in and take the pulse of the president every morning and make sure he's still living. And that's the only thing I do. Since FDR, that has changed a lot. We have seen a growth in the duties of the vice presidency to where today the vice president, for the most part, has had some really strong roles, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years. They then looked at the process of succession in times of crisis. What happens if a president is assassinated, which we have happened? What happens if the president goes under surgery and can't do his offices, whatever? We reviewed the 25th Amendment, in case we have to remove a president for some ailment or whatever, or impropriety or whatever. And then there's the process of impeachment, which we have seen two presidents in the last, 20, 25 years impeached, President Clinton and President Trump. Neither one were convicted, neither one was removed from office, but we have seen impeachment proceedings. And then we finally looked at the ways that the president approaches being effective, which is some of what we're going to talk about today. They use party loyalty, they use lobbyists, they use personal appeals, they use public opinion, they manipulate the media. So with that being said, let's move on to speak about the presidency. Finish up today. One of the aspects of the presidency, which is not mentioned in the Constitution, but makes up a very important part of the executive branch today, is the bureaucracy. Now, most of us are never going to encounter a president or a cabinet level official or anybody like that. I've been fortunate to meet three presidents. And when I say meet, I mean to the point that I shook two of them's hand and I just saw the other one, from a relatively small distance. Most of us are never going to have an opportunity to meet a president and discuss with them anything. That just doesn't happen in today's world. So most of us encounter government officials, executive government officials, in what's known as the bureaucracy, Social Security officials, the Department of Motor Vehicles, these kind of things. This is the bureaucracy. And it's basically this large public complex administrative structure that's been built up. It's characterized by hierarchical authority, job specification, formal rules, whose purpose is to implement policy. There's a lot of these folks around anymore, folks. Now, the Constitution doesn't give us any guidance. It doesn't mention the bureaucracy, but it has grown to the point that there's anywhere from estimated 17 to 18 million people in the federal, state, and local bureaucracy. That's a lot, okay? That's a very large part of our employees in the United States of America. So, this is where we meet the government, is with the bureaucracy. Unfortunately, sometimes that's not a good experience, as we'll see here in a few minutes. Now, for the most part, government officials used to get their jobs by whoever controlled the political party. It's called the spoils system. It's called patronage. Presidents, for instance, used to spend much of their time interviewing people and granting jobs. It is said that President Lincoln, in the midst of the Civil War, set one day aside of the week to do nothing but fill offices. It's amazing to me that he would have to take a full day out of the week to sit around and meet people and fill offices, post offices, stuff, postmasters, things. That used to be the president had to appoint all those, had to meet and basically decide those things. It's amazing that we had to do that. Well, that all ended to some degree in the 1880s. 1881, President Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled job seeker, and Congress said, "Hey, we can't let this happen again." So they basically passed a bunch of legislation to do away with the spoils system and patronage. Didn't do away with it totally, but it's, at least for the most part. They passed the Pendleton Act in 1883, which created a system by which federal employees were chosen on the basis of examinations, a merit system, a meritocracy, eliminating the spoils system. And then they passed the Hatch Act in 1939, which protected civil service employees from political pressure and outlined political activities they could engage in. So basically, they kind of tried to create a group of employees that was free from political pressure and could not be fired purely because they belonged to one political party or the other. Here's the problem. This thing has grown to such a huge level that it has become almost a government unto itself. They did pass the Civil Service Reform Act, which created the Office of Personnel Management and Budget, personnel management, which basically sets all the salaries, and in a sense, almost took it out of the control of Congress and the president. So, here's the problem. This bureaucracy has grown so big that it is just absolutely almost taken over the government. And you might say, well, how does it do this? Well, it's done it by things like paying subsidies to groups or organizations. They transfer money from federal, local, and state governments. They devise and enforce regulations. In other words, they just absolutely create this monstrosity of regulations, and they control so much money that they are able, in a sense, to be able to control much of the inner workings of the government. The result is it doesn't have a very good reputation. If you were to ask people what their attitude about bureaucracy is, they would tell you flat out, they don't care much for it. I mean, we've all been there. I remember one time I went to the DMV, and I never encountered such a rude person in my life that absolutely it's like they had to take lessons to be that rude. I've never encountered anyone quite that bad working in a system. Yeah, I can guarantee you, I, as a person that worked in the school system for 38 years, if I had been that rude to my patrons, my parents, they would have fired me on the spot. It's just absolutely, sometimes has such a negative attitude about the bureaucracy. And it's almost got to the point where it's almost a pejorative word. It's almost like a cuss word when you say the bureaucracy. People see it with contempt. And yet, at the same time, we also see it with gratitude when we need it. For instance, if it's during a crisis, during a flood or a hurricane or a tornado, most of us appreciate the bureaucracy when it comes to help us. In recent years, that bureaucracy has really taken up almost a more sinister image. You've probably heard the term deep state. This was something that's kind of arrived over the last 10 or 15 years. It's kind of this idea that there's a clandestine network of members of the federal government, particularly the FBI and the CIA, working in conjunction with all these high-level financial and industrial leaders to almost create a shadow government. Now, some people just laugh when you talk about the deep state. Some people believe it thoroughly. All I know for this is that when we have an emergency, we're very thankful when we see a bureaucrat. And I love this cartoon. Here's this guy that's been flooded out, and he got a sign up in his front yard that says, "Get the government off my backs." And he's floating on a piece of wood. He says, "Thank goodness, a federal bureaucrat," when he sees the FEMA boat. I suspect that's how most of us feel in times of emergency and in crisis. At the same time, there's a lot of people feel like there's a swamp out there, and that the swamp needs to be drained. It's just that there's so much out there that no one is in control of. It's almost like I said, an entity amongst itself with no control over. So this deep state that we hear talked about over the last 10 or 15 years, it's actually been around for a while. It's been called different things. Eisenhower actually warned us about this when he left the presidency in his farewell address. He warned of something he called an iron triangle, which was kind of a military industrial complex in his farewell address. And he said, folks, we need to watch out for this because there are people, politicians, bureaucrats, lobbyists, financiers, they're all conniving together to provide information and services to each other. And the result is that they are creating this almost huge government that operates without any control. So you can believe that there's a deep state out there. You can, think it's so much of a conspiracy theory. Everybody has their feelings about it. And folks, we're talking about people on both sides of the political spectrum here. On the right, people see George Soros, with his unlimited amount of money financing all these attorney generals and all these prosecutors and to defund the police And on the left, they see the Koch brothers. One of them is deceased now, but they see the Koch brothers as implementing this Project 2025 and these other things and the Federalist uh, uh, you know system and all that. They see all sorts of sinister things going on. And in all honesty, they're probably both right to some degree. There is a little bit of problem with that. Now, none of this could take place if there really wasn't some problems with the bureaucracy. That's the problem, folks. There really are problems with the bureaucracy. There's a tremendous amount of waste. Uh, the federal budget for the defense in this nation is 80 some $billion a year. Huge amount of money is spent on the defense mechanism. And I don't think anybody disagrees that we shouldn't spend money for defense. I'm not saying that. Here's the problem. Every year they audit the Defense Department, and every year they can't account for about 10% of their money. They say, well, we don't know where it went. Now, again, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you think there's people out there spending money on programs, all these supposed things that we're seeing in the sky at night. People are saying, well, those are just secret projects the government's got created. Very well may be. I'm not saying there's not there. I'm just saying that there is a lot of waste. We've all heard the stories of the $800 toilet seat. These kind of things. There's a tremendous amount of red tape. I had the real pleasure of calling the Social Security 800 number a week or two ago because I had a problem that I had to deal with, and the local Social Security agency told me that I needed to dial the 800 number, so I did. I waited for 3 hours. 3 hours of listening to music play in my ear as I went about and did other things until 5 o'clock rolled around and it shut off. Nobody was there anymore. The result was I had to call back the next day, and I finally got somebody. But there is so much red tape that is just an unbelievable situation so many times with the bureaucracy. There's a lack of consumer-friendly atmosphere. I think we all know this. And then there's these agencies that just seem to grow without regard to benefits. It seemed like all of a sudden you see an agency that ought to be able to deal with the problems with a few thousand people having hundreds of thousands of people on the payroll. And it's a real problem. On top of that, there seems to be a real duplication of effort in many of these agencies. So yes, folks, there are real problems, conflicting accountability. Who do they actually answer to? Yeah, so we got the department of this and the department of that and the department of the other thing. Now, President Trump, elect President Trump, says that he's going to deal with this. He's created DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and he's put Vivek Ramaswamy, finally where I could pronounce his name correctly, I hope, and Elon Musk in charge of it. And he says, I want these two guys to go in and they're going to clean this swamp up and they're going to get rid of all these bureaucratic problems. Well, that's just between me and you. I'll believe it when I see it. To my surprise, there's people on both sides of the political spectrum, all the way from Ted Cruz to Bernie Sanders agrees with this. They're saying we need this. We need to clean out the swamp. So it will be interesting to see just exactly what they actually get accomplished. I've noticed in the news the last couple of days they're already getting into some problems within, the people they're supposed to be cleaning up. So we'll see what happens. Now, we began this whole thing about the presidency with talking about how the president was the most important and powerful person in the world, and he is. There is absolutely no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean there are not limits on the American president. So yes, he is the most powerful person in the world, but he's not all powerful. And he does have a series of constraints that forces him to be accountable to us, the voters. Now, some of these constraints are embedded in the Constitution, and others have just kind of evolved over time. For instance, the Constitution specifically establishes a checks and balance system and a separation of powers. We've been through this several times, so you know that. He's also under constant pressure to win public support for his agenda. If he's going to be effective, he has to have public support. If he loses the public support, then he's going to cease to be an effective president. And we have seen that happen. We have just seen that happen. President Biden apparently lost the public support for his presidency because the image is that he's not an effective leader anymore, and that's the reason that he basically withdrew from the presidency, running for the presidency. He's under constant campaign pressure to campaign. He's absolutely, he's out there constantly either running for office himself or he's out there running for other people. It's always interesting to see the difference between a president the first 4 years when they're running for office again, because most of them anymore, anticipate winning and doing 8-year terms. And presidents in their second term, when they're no longer under the constraint to campaign for themselves, they're still under constraints to campaign for the people in their own political party, but they're not under pressure to campaign for themselves. It's increasingly under review by the watchdog media. Boy, have we seen this. Now, this has changed dramatically over the decades. It used to be that personal flaws that were not criminal were once kind of considered to be off limits, for the most part. We're going to kind of look at this in a minute. Probably no more evident than the reluctance of the media to publicize President Kennedy's many affairs, even though the press was knowledgeable about them. And they were very knowledgeable about it. But we know this now. We'll talk about this more in a minute here. But, there was definitely a sense that the press knew what was going on. That started to change in the 1980s. Part of it changed because you begin to see other media rather than there used to be this central media, the 3 television networks plus 4 or 5 national newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times and all these, that kind of controlled what was sent out to the media. Now you have a lot of alternative media out there, and it's not nearly as easy to cover up things as it used to be. For instance, let's look at this here. In the 19th century, the press had a really curious mixture of either overlooking or sensationalizing president scandals. For instance, Jefferson's longtime affair with his slave, Sally Hemings, was pretty much ignored, even when it became knowledge. At the same time, Andrew Jackson's marriage to Rachel, his wife, who had kind of neglected to actually get a legal divorce from her first husband, was not very widely reported in the beginning. Now, when it came time for the second run around, it was. Grant supposedly was a raging alcoholic, according to some people. There's a lot of historians that say that's not really the case, that he really didn't have that much of a drinking problem. Yes, he probably realized early on in his drinking that he had a problem that was going to cease. It was going to create problems doing his job as a general in the Army. And he basically stopped. There's a very humorous story where when Lincoln appointed Grant to be in charge of the Union Army, that some of his detractors came to Lincoln and said, "You can't possibly put this man in charge of the Army. Don't you know he has a drinking problem?" And Lincoln says, "Are you sure about that?" They said, "We're absolutely sure." And he says, "Well, fine. Order a keg of it for every one of my generals." If that's what it takes to win, which is what Grant was doing. He said, then get them all drunk, Now, I don't know if that actually happened or not, but that's a story that's reported. On the other hand, Grover Cleveland reportedly fathered an wedlock child. And that was basically covered up, although there was an instance where when they were having the convention where Cleveland was going to be nominated for the presidency, there were some detractors out in the audience that broke out into the little chant of, ha, 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 where's my paw? Going to the White House, ha, ha, ha. Again, it was kind of covered up for the most part. And then you had Woodrow Wilson, who was, a very, controlling president while he was president, had a very debilitating stroke toward the last year of his presidency. We knew nothing about this as a public. The media absolutely covered up the fact that his wife actually ran the government for the last year of his life. He was bedridden, completely, unable to fulfill his office. At the same time, FDR, we all know now that FDR had a physical disability, which is no big deal today. Back in those days, it was seen as a very big deal. So the media basically covered up FDR's physical disability. There are only 2 known photographs of FDR in a wheelchair over his 4 terms in office. They would not photograph him in such a way that people would come to believe he was incapable of fulfilling his office. We now know it had absolutely nothing to do with his ability to fill the office of president. But that was not necessarily the case then. In between those two, you had Warren Harding, who many people regard as the most scandal-ridden president of all, who had some really serious problems with scandals and bribery, like the Teapot Dome and some of these things. Of course, in more recent years, we've seen the Watergate scandal. We've seen the Iran-Contra scandal under Reagan. We've seen Clinton's scandal with Monica Lewinsky. But it was JFK that probably is the one that most people kind of look to when it comes to covering up by the media. And this is the president that kind of basically forced the media to come to what they call a reckoning. They had to decide, are we going to let this continue to happen? Or are we going to try to get to the point where we really will let people know what's happening? And folks, there were some really serious problems with JFK and his problems. I think everybody knows now, if you read anything about JFK, that he liked women. Let me put it that way. I'll be just as nice about it as I can be. He had numerous affairs, not only while he was president, but before he was president. Mary Pinchot Meyer was probably one that during his office that he had a very strong relationship with. That's a very important one. And I'll tell you why. Her brother-in-law was Ben Bradley, who happened to be the editor of the Washington Post, probably the most powerful newspaper in America at that time, and probably even still yet today for political situations. And he was very knowledgeable about what was going on. And yet there was never 1 inch of print media about JFK and his relationships. Of course, I think you've probably all heard of Judith Exner, who was, again, one of JFK's reported, affairs. The problem with her was that she was also having an affair at the same time with Sam Giancana, the head of the Chicago mob. A lot of concerns there. A lot of conspiracy theorists believe that this is all kind of connected in with the assassination of JFK. I've read all these books. I don't know. By the way, JFK had his intern also, 19-year-old Mimi Alford. She was reportedly in an affair with him for almost 2 years. And of course, we all know about Marilyn Monroe today. On On top of this, folks, before he was even president, before he was even senator or congressman, in World War II, when he was working in naval intelligence, he struck up a relationship with a lady by the name of Ingrid Arbad, who was a reported Nazi spy. And it got to the point where J. Edgar Hoover went to, reportedly, JFK's father and told him, said, you either got to break this off or we're going to have to do something about it. And at that point, JFK broke off the relationship. Folks, this is the kind of covering up that really can cause serious problems in our government. And I think after it was all said and done and everybody took a breath, the media, I'm talking about the media, they said, we can't let this happen again. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. Lyndon Johnson supposedly maybe had some affairs. Richard Nixon, no one ever accused him of that. No one really ever accused Gerald Ford, and most certainly not Jimmy Carter. But in the 80s, there arose another situation where Senator Gary Hart from Colorado was running for the nomination in 1988 for the Democratic Party nomination for president. And he was widely expected to get the nomination. And many people believe that he would have beat George H.W. Bush, the vice president of the United States. Unfortunately for Gary Hart, there got to be a rumor that he was having an affair with a woman. He was married at the time, and a woman by the name of Marla Maples. And they confronted him. The media actually confronted him with this and said, there's a lot of people think that you are having, an illegal adulterous affair with a lady. And he got very indignant on camera and basically told the media, well, if you think that, then just catch me, almost issuing a challenge to the media. The media accepted, and it wasn't long before they got a picture of him and Marla Maples together on their boat, the Monkey Business. Honest to God, folks, that was the name of the boat, the Monkey Business. Sunk Gary Hart's career. I mean, immediately off the radar. Never heard from again. As didn't run for senator again from Colorado. Never heard again. Probably would have made a fairly good president. By the way, Marla Maples, if you don't know, ended up marrying, anybody know out there? Donald Trump. Okay, so isn't it amazing how things just goes in circles in this country? Okay, the watchdog media finally became victorious. After they went after Hart, they really started going. And of course, we all know that they were very successful in the last, at least in a couple of the latter presidencies. Bill Clinton and his affair with Monica Lewinsky, which absolutely almost derailed his presidency. Some people still feel like, that he was probably should have not won the second term because of this. And of course, now we have Donald Trump, who has had been found guilty in courts of law for having affairs. And it's just, it's just a mess, folks. It's just an absolute mess. Here's the question that we all have to face today. Just yesterday, CBS News reporter was asked, Jan Crawford was asked, what is the most underreported story in America for 2024? They were having a roundtable discussion. She said, well, there's absolutely no doubt that, the mental decline of President Biden was the most underreported story. I don't know what's going to come of this. I suspect in the next year that we're going to find out a lot more about what actually went on this past year or two or three in President Biden's presidency. It may not be as bad as what some people think. It may be a whole lot worse. We don't really know right now. I think we're all aware. I think anybody that watched that debate is aware that he definitely is suffering from some age problems. And, folks, I understand this. I'm approaching 80 myself, and I can guarantee you I totally understand the situation that he's faced with. I can't even imagine the pressures that he was under as president of the United States. I still consider myself mentally fairly, okay. I can guarantee you I would have absolutely no business in that office. I can't imagine the pressures that he is under at that stage of his life. It's a tough job for a young person, let alone someone of our age. So it will be interesting to find out just exactly what comes out, and it will come out. I can guarantee you that. So, presidential greatness. We're going to finish up with this. One of the favorite topics that people like to engage in, particularly historians, is the greatest presidents and the worst presidents. And they've done this now for many, many years. And C-SPAN usually has a survey of some of these great historians, and they say, tell us who the best presidents and the worst presidents were. Well, the last one that I've been able to find was 2021. And this is how they rated the presidents. They rated them on public persuasion, moral authority, relations with Congress, crisis leadership, foreign relations, vision, economic management, administrative skills, commitments to equal justice. So here's how it turned out. First of all, we had the 10 greatest presidents. This is how historians have rated it in 2021. They said that Lyndon Johnson was number 10, Barack Obama was number 9, John F. Kennedy, number 8, Thomas Jefferson, number 7. Jefferson was rated the number 1 president for many, many years until the situation with Sally Hemings became clarified, and he's dropped since that time. Harry Truman, we're going to talk about more about this in a minute, number 6. Dwight Eisenhower, number 5. Theodore Roosevelt, number 4. Franklin Roosevelt, number 3. George Washington, number 2. And Abraham Lincoln, number 1. These are the historians saying these are the greatest presidents. You'll notice that most of them are a little bit more modern, except for Washington and Lincoln and, Teddy Roosevelt. Most of them are basically 20th century presidents. Worst presidents, number 32, Zachary Taylor. Herbert Hoover, number 33, who had the unfortunate, affair of being elected president right at the beginning of the Great Depression. Warren Harding, who was one of the most scandal-ridden presidents. Millard Fillmore, who did absolutely nothing. John Tyler, who a lot of people feel like probably started the Civil War. William Henry Harrison only lived a month, so how could he be rated as a good president? Donald Trump, number 38. Franklin Pierce, number 39. And the worst president, Andrew Johnson, number 40. Okay. This is the most recent survey. Pardon me, James Buchanan, number 41, over the president right before the Civil War. So here's the problem. These are snapshots, people. We look at presidents and it's really easy right now to rate somebody like Donald Trump as a bad president. Whether you believe that or not, you can see why some people would believe it, particularly the media, who we all know does not have a good attitude about Donald Trump. It's really easy to look at a president while there's president or immediately after president and say, this guy has not been a very good president. I suspect Joe Biden will be somewhere towards the bottom for a while. Eventually, things happen. You notice here who's not in this, either great or worst, Richard Nixon. I remember after Nixon left office, there were people who said he was absolutely the worst president in American history. He's rated up in the 20s now, because as you get further away from the president of his term in office, you begin to realize, some of the things he did really weren't that bad, and he really did a lot of things that were end up proving right. No better example of this exists than Harry Truman. So let's talk about Harry Truman. When Harry Truman left office, in 1953, he was the most unpopular president in American history up to that point, mainly because of his handling of the Korean War. People just thought he did not do a very good job, uh, particularly after he fired General Douglas MacArthur, because Douglas MacArthur was kind of the hero of the Pacific Campaign in World War II, and he and Truman had a real headbutting relationship, and Truman ended up firing him, and it really hurt Truman. And like I said, when he left office, he was the most lowest rated president in American history as far as popularity. Since that time, people have looked back at his presidency and they is now rated as the sixth greatest president. How did that happen? Well, here's how it happened. Number one, they said, well, he used the atomic bomb. Yes, a lot of people are still very upset about that. But folks, it was going to get used one way or the other by somebody. He knew this. He knew that either we used it or somebody else was going to use it. And everyone pretty well agrees that he probably saved 1 million American lives, you know, in the Pacific campaign. If we had had to invade Japan the way they were fighting for their lives, it would have been an unbelievable bloodbath on both sides. He also oversaw the creation of the UN. He wasn't the stimulus for it, but he was the president when it was taking place. He implemented the Marshall Plan, which a lot of people didn't like at the time. They said, why are you spending all this money on rebuilding Germany and Japan, when, we just got done defeating them? Turned out to be the right thing to do. He implemented the Berlin Airlift when the Soviet Union was trying to basically take over all of Europe. And he basically saved Europe from control by the Soviet Union because of the Berlin Airlift. He recognized the state of Israel, which was not a very popular thing to do in 1947, folks. He integrated the armed forces. He said, this is ridiculous. We have just fought a world war with races segregated in the armed forces, and that's not going to happen anymore. And he integrated the armed forces. And then he kept the Korean conflict, even though he was kind of really, looked down upon for the way he handled the Korean conflict. We now realize he basically kept it from becoming World War III. So, yes, Harry Truman was not a very good president, according to people when he was president. Now that he's been out of office for 60 years, people say this guy was one of the greatest presidents we've ever had in American history. It makes you wonder where some of our more recent presidents are going to rate after the, after the presidency is over. It's a really amazing thing. This is something that as a historian, I really like looking at, because it makes me realize that presidents that I've known in my lifetime that were not rated very highly are all of a sudden become very highly rated presidents, and presidents that were thought of as great presidents at the time are suddenly going down the list. It'll be an interesting thing to see how far this goes over the next few decades. I probably won't be around to see it, but it would be interesting to see where it goes. So that's it for the day, folks. Next week, we're going to start looking at the Supreme Court for a couple of weeks, because it operates like no other court in America. I want to wish you all a very happy new year. I hope you guys really have a good time. Stay up late tomorrow night and celebrate. And if you're like me, I'll be in bed by 9 o'clock. So anyway, I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys being with us. I hope you've had a good time. I hope you've learned a few things. And anyway, I will see you next week. Bye, Donna Hart. Bye, Township people. Good to see you. Tell some of those people